On the evening of November the 8th, 1976, at approximately 6:15 p.m., a 34-year-old woman named Marina Sokolova found a document in her apartment that would destroy the most important friendship of her life. She had arrived home from the textile machinery plant 20 minutes earlier, her fingers still stiff from the cold walk from the metro station. The Arbat district stretched grey and utilitarian around her building, a 5-story concrete structure identical to dozens of others that had risen across Moscow in the previous decade. Marina climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, her breath visible in the unheated stairwell, and unlocked the door to apartment 47. The space consisted of 2 rooms, a larger one where Marina and her daughter slept, and a smaller one that served as kitchen and living area. They shared the apartment with the Petrov family, husband, wife, and teenage son, who occupied the remaining 2 rooms. A communal bathroom stood at the end of the hallway. Marina had lived here since her divorce 3 years earlier. She was an engineer. Her daughter, Katya, was 9 years old. Katya sat at the small table doing homework, her dark hair falling across her face as she bent over a mathematics textbook. The radiator hissed and clanked, fighting against November's chill. Marina set down her bag and removed her coat, hanging it on the hook near the door. "How was school?" she asked. "Fine, Mama. We had singing practice." Marina moved toward the radiator, intending to adjust the valve. The heating in these buildings was erratic, either scalding or freezing, rarely comfortable. She knelt on the wooden floor, reaching behind the cast-iron fixture to find the control mechanism. Her hand brushed against something that shouldn't have been there. Paper. Several sheets folded together. She pulled them out. Dust clung to the pages, suggesting they had been there for some time, though she had cleaned this area just 2 weeks before. The papers were thin, official weight, typewritten. At the top of the first page, stamped in red ink, "Confidential Operational File 2847OM." Marina's hands began to shake. The document was a surveillance summary. 3 pages in total. Dated October 17th, 1976, 22 days ago. The text described conversations she had held in September, specific exchanges she remembered clearly. Things she had said in the privacy of her own apartment, observations about her factory director's incompetence, concerns about Katya's teacher requiring students to memorize lengthy ideological passages instead of teaching mathematics properly. A mention of a book she had read, one that circulated secretly among certain circles, passed hand to hand in unmarked covers. The informant was designated as Source Vesna. Spring. Marina read the first paragraph, then stopped. She felt her stomach contract. The room tilted slightly. She steadied herself against the radiator, metal warm beneath her palm, and forced her eyes back to the page. Subject 2847M expressed frustration regarding production quotas at Factory 14, the report stated. She told Source Vesna that the director demands impossible targets while failing to maintain equipment. Subject used the phrase, "We are expected to spin thread from nothing." She had said exactly that, those precise words. But she had said them to only one person. Marina turned to the second page. More conversations, more details, a discussion about whether life might be different in Leningrad or perhaps Kiev, somewhere away from Moscow's intensity. A question she had raised about foreign films, wondering if they were really as decadent as the party claimed, or if some might have artistic merit. Comments about her ex-husband Alexei's continued interference in decisions about Katya's upbringing. Each statement was something she had shared during their Thursday evening conversations. Over tea. In this room. The third page contained notes from a meeting on September 26th. The informant had reported that subject 2847M seemed tired, possibly overworked, that she had complained of headaches, that she wondered aloud whether the factory position was worth the stress when the pay barely covered rent and food. This conversation had occurred 4 days after the September 22nd discussion. Marina remembered it distinctly because it had been an unusually honest evening. She had been exhausted, vulnerable. Her friend had listened with such apparent sympathy, had even suggested Marina take a day off work, had offered to watch Katya if needed. The document slipped from Marina's fingers and fell to the floor. She stared at it lying there, the pages slightly separated, the red stamp visible on the uppermost sheet. Her breath came shallow and quick. The radiator continued its rhythmic knocking. From the other room she could hear Mrs. Petrova talking to her husband, their voices muffled through the thin wall. 20 years. They had known each other for 20 years, since university. Every Thursday evening for longer than Marina could calculate. Walks in Gorky Park on Sundays when weather permitted. Birthdays celebrated together. The friend who had held Marina's hand in the hospital when Katya was born. The person she trusted more than anyone except her daughter. Irina. It could only be Irina. Marina picked up the document again, her hands steadier now despite the nausea rising in her throat. She examined each page methodically, looking for some alternative explanation. Perhaps she had mentioned these things to someone else. A colleague at work? A neighbor? But the September 26th conversation, the one about her headaches and exhaustion, that had happened here, in this room. She had been sitting exactly where she sat now. Irina had occupied the chair across from her, the one currently holding Katya's school bag. No one else could have reported these words. No one else had been present. The implications spread through Marina's mind like cracks in ice. If Irina had reported this conversation, she had likely reported others. The document referenced Operational File 2847M, suggesting an ongoing investigation. How long had this been happening? How many of their evenings together had been performances? How much of their friendship had been real? "Mama?" Katya's voice came from behind her. "What are you doing?" Marina folded the pages quickly, pressing them against her chest. She turned, forcing her face into something resembling normalcy. "Just fixing the radiator, sweetheart. It was making noise." "Oh." Katya returned her attention to her homework. Marina stood slowly, the document clutched in her hand. She needed to hide it. She needed to think. She needed to understand how it had come to be behind her radiator, who had placed it there, whether its presence in her apartment represented a test or a warning or simply carelessness. But her legs would not move. She remained frozen beside the radiator, the evidence of betrayal pressed against her body, her mind unable to process what came next. The life she had understood 5 minutes ago no longer existed. The friend she had trusted was someone else entirely. The walls of her small apartment seemed suddenly porous, penetrated by eyes and ears she had never suspected. "Mama, I'm hungry," Katya said. "Can we have dinner soon?" Marina looked at her daughter, 9 years old, innocent, unaware that the woman she called Aunt Irina had spent years cataloguing her mother's every doubt and frustration. That the Thursday evenings Katya loved, when Irina brought sweets and played games with her, were also sessions of intelligence gathering. "Yes," Marina managed. "Soon." She walked to the bookshelf, her movements mechanical, and slid the document between the pages of a thick volume on engineering principles. Her hands had stopped shaking. In their place came a cold clarity. She could not confront this. Not yet. She needed to understand everything first. She needed to know how long, how deep, how much danger she had accumulated through years of honest conversation with someone who had never been honest in return. Marina moved to the small kitchen area and began preparing dinner, going through familiar motions while her thoughts raced. Behind her, Katya hummed quietly, working on mathematics problems. The Petrovs' voices continued their indistinct murmur through the wall. The radiator knocked and hissed. Everything appeared exactly as it had 15 minutes ago, but Marina Sokolova now lived in a different world entirely. Marina and Irina Volkova had met on September 1st, 1956, the first day of classes at Moscow State University. They sat beside each other in Introduction to Mathematical Theory. Both nervous 18-year-olds from provincial cities, both clutching new notebooks and fountain pens. The lecture hall held 200 students, yet somehow they gravitated toward one another during the break. Two young women who recognized in each other the same mix of ambition and uncertainty that came with being the first in their families to attend university. Irina was from Voronezh, a city 400 kilometers south of Moscow. Her father worked in the regional party administration, managing agricultural quotas. Not high-ranking, but respectable, her mother taught primary school. They had raised Irina to be careful, correct, attentive to rules and hierarchies. She arrived at university with her paperwork immaculately organized, her Communist Youth League credentials already in order, her hair always neatly pinned. Marina came from Tula, an industrial city known for its weapons factories and metalworks. Her father operated machinery on a production line. Her mother worked in a cafeteria. They had raised Marina to ask questions, to solve problems, to value competence over protocol. She had joined the Youth League, because everyone did, but approached it as a requirement rather than a calling. Despite these differences, or perhaps because of them, the friendship took root quickly. They studied together through that first autumn, sprawled on narrow dormitory beds, working through problem sets until the early hours. Mathematics became their shared language. Irina's methodical precision complemented Marina's intuitive leaps. They developed a rhythm, Irina checking calculations, Marina finding creative solutions, both pushing each other toward better work. The university years passed in a blur of lectures, exams, and mandatory political meetings. They navigated the Komsomol activities together, the volunteering, the discussion groups, the ceremonial events. Irina took these seriously, recording attendance and participating earnestly. Marina performed her duties adequately but without particular enthusiasm. Neither stance caused problems. They were in all visible ways model Soviet students. After graduation in 1960, both remained in Moscow. Jobs were assigned, Marina to a textile machinery plant as a junior engineer, Irina to a planning office handling production statistics. They kept their friendship alive through weekly meetings, usually on Thursday evenings. Marina married Alexei Sokolov in May 1961. He was a junior party functionary, serious and ambitious. Irina attended the wedding, helped Marina move into Alexei's apartment, visited regularly during the early years. When Katya was born in February 1967, Irina was at the hospital within hours, bringing flowers and a stuffed rabbit that Katya would keep for years. Irina's own romantic life proved less successful. There were a few men over the years, a fellow bureaucrat, an accountant, a widowed professor. None developed into marriage. By her early 30s, she lived with her mother in a small apartment near Kursk station, seemingly resigned to permanent unmarried status. If this caused her pain, she rarely showed it. She devoted herself to her work, to caring for her aging mother, and to her friendship with Marina. The political landscape shifted around them. Khrushchev's thaw brought relative openness in the early 60s, foreign films at special screenings, slightly less rigid cultural control, whispered conversations about Stalin's crimes. Then came Khrushchev's removal in 1964, followed by the Brezhnev era's settling into what would later be called stagnation. The women adapted, as everyone did. They learned which topics were safe for public discussion and which required privacy. They understood the boundaries, or so Marina had believed. The friendship deepened through Marina's personal crises. When her marriage began failing in 1971, Alexei's drinking, his affairs, his increasing verbal cruelty, Marina confided everything to Irina. Those Thursday evening conversations became therapy sessions. Marina describing her humiliation, her fear, her growing determination to leave. Irina listening for hours, offering sympathy, occasionally suggesting caution but never judgment. The divorce in 1973 was ugly. Alexei fought for custody of Katya, claiming Marina was emotionally unstable. He had party connections. Marina had Irina's testimony about her competence as a mother. The court awarded Marina custody, though the judge made clear it was a near decision. Throughout the proceedings, Irina attended hearings, brought meals, watched Katya when needed. 2 years later, when Marina suffered a severe respiratory infection requiring hospitalization, Irina took Katya for an entire week. She brought the girl to visit every evening, maintained her school routine, made sure homework was completed. Marina recovered to find her daughter well cared for and Irina exhausted but cheerful. These were the moments Marina thought of as proof of genuine friendship. Real love, she had believed, the kind that showed itself through action rather than words. Their routine had crystallized over the years into comforting predictability. Thursday evenings, Irina would arrive at Marina's apartment around 6, carrying sometimes tea, sometimes pastries from the good bakery near her office. They would talk for 2 or 3 hours, discussing work frustrations, family matters, Katya's progress in school. Sunday afternoons, when weather permitted, walks in Gorky Park, Katya running ahead while the women strolled behind, conversation flowing easily. Now, sitting on her apartment floor on the evening of November the 8th, 1976, Marina forced herself to review those conversations through a different lens. She remembered Irina's questions, which had always seemed like normal interest. How was the new factory director working out? What did Marina's colleagues think of the latest production quotas? Had Marina heard any interesting perspectives on life in other cities, other countries? These queries had felt like friendly curiosity. Marina had answered honestly, never suspecting each response might be recorded, filed, analyzed. The past year in particular, 1975 into 1976, took on new significance. Irina had become more attentive, if anything. More questions about Marina's opinions on various matters, more careful listening as though memorizing details. Marina had attributed this to Irina's loneliness, her investment in their friendship, as her own life remained stagnant. Certain behavioral patterns emerged in Marina's memory now, illuminated by the surveillance report still hidden in her engineering textbook. Irina's notebook, for instance. She always carried a small leather-bound book, perhaps 3 inches by 5 inches. Marina had seen her write in it countless times, shopping lists, supposedly, or reminders about her mother's medications. But Irina's memory for exact phrases had always been remarkable. She could quote conversations from weeks prior with unsettling precision. "You said the director was demanding impossible targets," Irina had once reminded her. "Those were your exact words, impossible targets. I remember because it sounded so emphatic." Marina had been flattered by such attentiveness. Evidence that Irina truly listened, truly cared. Other details surfaced. The way Irina would occasionally steer conversations back to specific topics, Marina's colleagues at the factory, for example. or her opinions about party policies. The questions seemed natural in context, part of normal discussion, but they formed a pattern Marina hadn't recognized. Intelligence gathering disguised as friendship. There had been moments of unease, Marina admitted to herself now, brief flashes of something not quite right. Last spring, when Marina had mentioned reading a forbidden book, Solzhenitsyn, passed to her by a university acquaintance, Irina's expression had flickered strangely before settling into neutral interest. At the time, Marina had interpreted this as nervousness. Now she wondered if Irina had been calculating whether to report this directly or wait for more details. In August, Irina had asked, unprompted, about Marina's ex-husband's current party position. "Just curious," she had said. "I worry he might try to cause trouble for you." The concern had seemed genuine. Perhaps it was genuine, coexisting somehow with the reporting. Marina didn't know. Couldn't know. The mathematics they had once studied together seemed cruelly relevant now. Every action has multiple variables. Every relationship contains unknown quantities. Marina had believed she knew all the values in this equation. She had been solving for the wrong answer all along. 20 years. 2 decades of shared history, secrets exchanged, trust built incrementally through countless small moments. Marina had told Irina things she had told no one else, not even Alexei during their marriage. Fears about her competence as a mother, doubts about her career choices, political questions she would never have voiced publicly. All of it potentially documented in files somewhere, in reports marked confidential, attributed to source Vesna. Spring. Irina had chosen that code name herself, presumably, or perhaps it had been assigned. Did it mean something? A reference to renewal? To new beginnings? Or simply an arbitrary designation? Marina pulled herself up from the floor, her knees stiff from kneeling. Katya had finished her homework and was reading a book, her small face absorbed in the story. Through the wall, the Petrovs' radio played evening news. Everything appeared normal. Everything was utterly changed. She had believed she understood the fundamental truth of her life, that in a world of surveillance and suspicion, she had one relationship built on genuine trust. This belief was now revealed as fantasy. The question remaining was how to proceed, whether confrontation served any purpose, whether the friendship could be salvaged or should be abandoned, whether Marina herself was now in danger for possessing the document she had found. But first, she needed to understand the full scope of what had been taken from her. 20 years of friendship had to be examined, reconsidered, understood anew. The betrayal wasn't merely recent, it might have been foundational. Marina needed to know when Irina Volkova had become source Vesna, and whether the woman she thought she knew had ever truly existed at all. The report was 6 pages long, typewritten on thin paper marked Confidential Operational File 2847M. Marina waited until after midnight to examine it properly. Katya slept in the narrow bed they shared, her breathing soft and even. The Petrovs had gone quiet hours ago. Marina sat at the small table with the documents spread before her, a single lamp casting yellow light across the pages. She had retrieved it from the engineering textbook, and now she read with the same methodical attention she applied to technical specifications at work. The first page contained administrative details. File number 28470M, established August 1974. Subject, Sokolova Marina Dmitrievna. Born February 1942, Tula. Current residence, Moscow, Arbat District, Apartment 47. Employment, engineer, textile machinery plant. 14. Marital status, divorced. Dependent, 1 daughter, Katerina, age 9. Security classification, Category 2, surveillance, domestic counterintelligence, 2 years. They had been building this file for 2 years, since shortly after her divorce. Marina felt her chest tighten, but forced herself to continue reading. The second page began the actual surveillance summaries, each dated and attributed to source Vesna. The first entry was marked September 12, 1976. Source Vesna reports that subject 2847M expressed significant frustration regarding workplace leadership. Subject stated that factory director Kuznetsov demands production quotas that require equipment we don't have and materials that aren't delivered. Subject used the phrase, "We are expected to spin thread from nothing." When source inquired whether subject had raised these concerns with management, subject responded that complaining only marks you as a troublemaker. Subject appeared resigned rather than actively hostile, but demonstrates pattern of criticism toward party-appointed leadership. Marina remembered this conversation precisely. It had occurred during their Thursday evening tea on September the 9th. The report was dated 3 days later, presumably when Irina met with her handler. They had been discussing work frustrations, something they did regularly. Marina had vented about the impossible situation at the factory, where Soviet planning created contradictions that workers were expected to resolve through miracle or deception. Irina had listened sympathetically, asked clarifying questions, offered commiseration about her own bureaucratic frustrations. The phrasing in the report carried traces of Irina's speech patterns. Significant frustration was the kind of formal construction Irina favored. More tellingly, the report preserved Marina's exact words, "spin thread from nothing," which demonstrated either excellent memory or notes taken shortly after the conversation. Marina thought of Irina's small leather notebook, the one she carried everywhere. The September 19th entry was longer, nearly a full page. It described a conversation about Katya's education. Marina had complained that the teacher, Comrade Lebedeva, spent excessive time on political instruction at the expense of mathematics and science. According to the report, Marina had specifically stated, "Katya can recite every word of the New Youth Pledge, but she's falling behind in arithmetic. What use is ideology if our children can't think?" The question was marked with underlining in the original document. Source Vesna had apparently asked whether Marina planned to request a different teacher. The report noted Marina's response. Subject stated that making such a request would draw unwanted attention. Subject expressed concern that challenging the educational approach might be interpreted as political unreliability, potentially affecting both her own position and her daughter's academic future. Subject demonstrates awareness of surveillance culture but continues to voice criticism in private settings. The analysis felt like violation. Marina had shared genuine parental anxiety with someone she trusted, seeking advice about an impossible situation. That vulnerability had been converted into evidence of political deviance. The phrase, "awareness of surveillance culture," particularly stung. Of course she was aware. Everyone was aware. The entire society operated on the assumption that careless speech could destroy lives. Marina had simply believed that Thursday evenings with Irina represented a sanctuary from that constant calculation. She had been catastrophically wrong. The September 26th entry was the one that had initially confirmed Irina's identity as the informant. It detailed the conversation about Marina's exhaustion, her headaches, her doubts about whether the factory position justified the stress. But reading it again, Marina noticed additional details she had missed during her initial shock. Subject mentioned reading a book that made her think differently about our system, the report stated. When source inquired about the title, subject became cautious, stating only that it was something passed around quietly and that she probably shouldn't have read it. Subject did not provide author or specific title. Recommend continued monitoring of subjects' reading materials and social contacts who might be distributing prohibited literature. This referred to One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, the Solzhenitsyn novel that circulated in samizdat copies despite official disapproval. Marina had mentioned it only vaguely, already regretting bringing it up even with Irina. The report captured her hesitation but also her admission of reading forbidden material. The recommendation for continued monitoring suggested this single statement had escalated her security profile. Further down the same page, subject questioned whether life might offer different opportunities in other Soviet cities, specifically mentioning Leningrad and Kiev. When source asked what subject meant by different opportunities, subject clarified, she wondered if smaller cities might have less pressure, less surveillance, more room to breathe. Subject quickly added that she had no actual plans to relocate and that Moscow was her home. Despite this disclaimer, statement indicates possible desire to escape oversight and suggests dissatisfaction with current level of state attention. The interpretation twisted her words into something more dangerous than intended. Marina had been musing idly about whether a quieter city might be less stressful, a sentiment probably shared by millions of Moscow residents. The report transformed this into evidence of anti-state sentiment, a desire to escape oversight. Every phrase contained potential threat. The document's format itself told a story. The standardized headers, the clinical language, the categorization system all indicated bureaucratic routine. This wasn't exceptional surveillance of a dangerous dissident. This was ordinary procedure, one file among thousands, perhaps millions. Marina Sokolova rated Category 2 surveillance, suggesting she fell somewhere in the middle of whatever classification system the KGB employed. Troubling enough to monitor, not important enough for intensive resources. The designation operational file implied ongoing activity. This wasn't a closed investigation or historical record. Somewhere in KGB headquarters, a file folder held these reports, plus presumably others. Marina's life was being documented, analyzed, assessed for risk. And she had never suspected. Her engineer's mind cut through the emotional chaos, identifying critical questions. First, timeline. The file was established August 1974, but when had Irina's involvement begun? Was source Vesna the original informant, or had there been others before her? Second, scope. These three reports covered September 1976, but the file would contain additional material. How much? How detailed? Third, motive. Why had Irina agreed to this? Coercion, compensation, ideological conviction? Fourth, and most immediately pressing, how had this document come to be behind Marina's radiator? The possibilities were limited. Someone had placed it there, either deliberately or accidentally. KGB officers conducted searches of suspect apartments routinely, sometimes without the residents' knowledge. Perhaps during such a search, an officer had dropped these pages, failing to notice their absence until later. This seemed unlikely. Security services were generally meticulous about classified material. Alternatively, the document had been left intentionally. A warning? A test? Some officer wanting Marina to know she was being watched, to frighten her into either complete silence or some action that would justify arrest. This possibility carried its own terror. If KGB knew she had found the report, then possessing it became another offense. She couldn't return it, couldn't report finding it, couldn't destroy it without potentially incriminating herself further. A third possibility occurred to her, though it seemed almost too mundane. Irina herself might have dropped it. Perhaps during a previous visit, carrying papers from a meeting with her handler, the report had slipped from her bag or pocket. This would mean Irina didn't know Marina had found it, which offered some advantage. Marina made a decision. She would not confront Irina immediately. Confrontation would reveal that she had the document, which might be dangerous. More importantly, confrontation would alert Irina, and through her, the KGB, that Marina now understood she was under surveillance. This would change her behavior, make her careful. eliminate whatever value she currently provided as a source. Better to maintain the illusion of ignorance, better to continue as though nothing had changed while she gathered information, assessed the full scope of the situation, and determined what actions, if any, might be safe. She needed a secure hiding place. Marina examined her bookshelf and selected a thick, technical manual on industrial machinery, English text over 600 pages, something she had been given during a factory training course years ago, but never fully read. Using a razor blade from the bathroom, she carefully cut a rectangular cavity in the center pages, deep enough to hold the folded document. The modification was nearly invisible unless someone opened the book to that exact section. She placed the manual back on the shelf among 24 other engineering texts. Unless someone conducted a page-by-page search of every book in the apartment, the document would remain hidden. And if someone did conduct such a search, Marina's situation was already beyond salvation. The clock showed 2:30 a.m. In a few hours, she would need to wake Katya, prepare breakfast, go to work. She would need to perform normalcy. Thursday was 3 days away. Irina would arrive at 6 o'clock, as she always did, carrying tea or sweets, smiling with apparent affection. Marina would need to smile back, to talk freely, to give no indication that everything had changed. The performance was beginning. Marina returned to bed, lying carefully beside her sleeping daughter, staring at the dark ceiling. Her mind worked through scenarios and strategies, running calculations without clear answers. The mathematics of survival in a surveillance state had no elegant solutions, only approximations, probabilities, acceptable losses. She thought of Irina choosing the code name Vesna. Spring. A season of renewal, of things hidden beneath winter's surface emerging into light. Perhaps Irina had found this poetic. Or perhaps it meant nothing at all, just a word selected from a list of approved designations. Marina closed her eyes, but didn't sleep. The document was hidden, but the knowledge it contained could never be concealed again. 20 years of friendship had been rewritten in 6 pages of surveillance summary. Now came the harder task. Living as though she didn't know what she knew, maintaining trust she no longer felt, performing a relationship that had been performance all along. The performance, Marina understood, might need to continue for years, perhaps forever. In Soviet life, some truths were too dangerous to speak and too important to forget. She would carry this knowledge silently, the way people carried so many other secrets, carefully, constantly, with the weight of it never quite fading into normalcy. To understand how Source Vesna operated, one must first understand the Soviet informant system of the 1970s, a vast network that historians estimate encompassed millions of citizens. The KGB distinguished between professional agents, trained intelligence officers working abroad or in specialized domestic operations, and civilian informants who lived ordinary lives while reporting on neighbors, colleagues, friends, and family. This second category formed the foundation of internal surveillance. By the Brezhnev era, the system had achieved industrial efficiency. Every workplace, apartment building, university, and social organization contained informants. Some were paid, others coerced, many simply doing their patriotic duty as they understood it. Recruitment followed established patterns. KGB officers identified potential informants through various channels: party recommendations, institutional connections, observed vulnerabilities. The approach was rarely dramatic. An officer would initiate contact, often in an official-seeming context, a routine interview about someone else perhaps, or a discussion about workplace security. The conversation would establish rapport, assess the person's reliability, and access to useful information. If the candidate seemed promising, cultivation began. This could take weeks or months. The officer would build relationship, demonstrate power to help or harm, and eventually present the recruitment proposition. Some people agreed immediately, especially those with strong ideological commitment to state security. Others required pressure. The pressure took many forms. For some it was threat, evidence of past mistakes, family members' questionable histories, rumors of political unreliability that could be either buried or pursued. For others it was incentive, apartment allocation, job advancement, permission for children to attend university, access to scarce goods. The system had decades of experience determining what each person valued most and making clear that cooperation ensured they received it. Once recruited, informants signed documents acknowledging their status and agreeing to regular reporting obligations. Meetings with handlers occurred on fixed schedules, weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly, depending on the informant's access and the target's priority. Reports could be verbal or written. The KGB preferred written documentation, typed copies, filed in operational folders. Some informants provided only occasional useful intelligence. Others, positioned within targets' intimate circles, became primary sources for comprehensive surveillance. The psychology of informants varied. Some genuinely believed they protected the Soviet state from enemies. They saw criticism of party policies or interest in forbidden literature as dangerous seeds that, if unchecked, could blossom into counter-revolutionary activity. Better to report small doubts than allow them to metastasize into active opposition. This rationalization allowed them to maintain self-image as patriots rather than betrayers. Others compartmentalized. They told themselves they reported only harmless information, protecting their targets by giving handlers innocuous details that satisfied bureaucratic quotas without causing actual harm. Whether this was true or self-deception depended on circumstances. KGB handlers knew how to press for more useful intelligence while letting informants believe they controlled what they revealed. Still others simply endured it. They had been trapped by circumstance or mistake into roles they couldn't escape without severe consequence. They reported because refusing meant destroying everything they had built: careers, homes, families. The system was designed to make collaboration easier than resistance. Statistical estimates suggest that in major Soviet cities during the 1970s, approximately 1 in every 20 to 40 adults served as an informant in some capacity. This meant any gathering of friends, any workplace conversation, any apartment building likely contained someone reporting to state security. The exact ratios remain uncertain. KGB archives released after the USSR's collapse were incomplete, with many documents destroyed. What is documented shows massive scale, millions of files, hundreds of thousands of active informants at any given time. Certain categories attracted particular attention. The intelligentsia, engineers, scientists, teachers, writers, had access to ideas and information the state considered potentially dangerous. Their education made them capable of sophisticated critique. Their professional networks provided channels for spreading dissent. Divorced women, especially those with children, were classified as vulnerable to foreign influence or moral corruption. Anyone with relatives abroad, anyone who asked too many questions, anyone whose loyalty seemed less than absolute, became candidates for monitoring. Technical professionals like Marina faced specific scrutiny. A 1972 KGB directive, declassified in 1996, emphasized surveillance of engineers at industrial facilities. These workers understood production failures, equipment shortages, the gap between official statistics and actual output. Their knowledge could feed Western intelligence assessments of Soviet economic weakness. The directive recommended placing informants within engineering departments to monitor defeatist sentiment and excessive criticism of planned economy mechanisms. Marina Sokolova embodied multiple risk factors. Her divorce from a party member raised questions about her reliability and judgment. Her education and position gave her access to factory operations and production data. Her daughter's approaching secondary school age meant Marina would soon navigate educational decisions that could reveal political attitudes. Most significantly, she lived in a communal apartment where neighbors observed her comings and goings, where visitors were noticed, where privacy was structural impossibility. The file established in August 1974, 1 month after her divorce was finalized, suggested the surveillance was triggered by that event. Divorce from party members often prompted security reviews. Alexei's accusations during custody proceedings claiming Marina was emotionally unstable would have appeared in official records. KGB protocol required assessing whether this instability might manifest as political unreliability. Marina understood this now, reconstructing the probable sequence. Sometime between August 1974 and September 1976, Irina had been recruited. The question was when. Sitting at her kitchen table on the morning of November the 9th, drinking tea while Katya ate breakfast before school, Marina considered possibilities. Had Irina informed throughout their entire friendship? The file designation suggested surveillance began in 1974, not 1956. This implied Irina's recruitment was recent, within the past 2 years. Unless earlier reports existed under different file numbers, a possibility Marina couldn't dismiss. What made Irina vulnerable to recruitment? Marina analyzed her friend's circumstances methodically. Irina was unmarried at 38, living with her elderly mother in a cramped apartment. Her job in planning bureaucracy was stable but not prestigious. She had no children, limited prospects for advancement, and a life that many would consider disappointingly narrow. The KGB could offer meaningful incentives, a separate apartment for Irina and her mother, something that typically required years on waiting lists, job security or possible promotion, assurance that her mother's pension would continue without complications. These weren't luxuries but necessities in a system where everything flowed through official channels that could easily be blocked. Alternatively, there might have been leverage. Irina's father had worked in agricultural administration during the Khrushchev era. That period's reforms and subsequent reversals had destroyed many careers. Perhaps there were irregularities in the family history, documents that could be discovered and acted upon, threats that made cooperation preferable to investigation. Or perhaps Irina had believed she was protecting Marina. Perhaps her handler had convinced her that reporting harmless details would prevent more aggressive surveillance, that by serving as source, she shielded her friend from cruder methods. Informants were often told they helped their targets by keeping files manageable, steering investigations away from serious consequences. Some believed it. Marina would never know the truth. She couldn't ask without revealing her knowledge. Even if she asked, she couldn't trust the answer. This was perhaps the deepest violation, not just the betrayal itself, but the impossibility of ever understanding it. Had any moment of their friendship been genuine? Had Irina's tears when Marina's marriage collapsed been real, emotion or performance? Had her care for Katya reflected authentic affection, or simply thorough operational tradecraft? When they laughed together during Sunday walks, was Irina truly present, or was she already composing that week's report? The questions had no answers. Relationships observed for operational purposes became indistinguishable from authentic connection. Maybe both existed simultaneously. Maybe Irina had loved Marina while betraying her, felt genuine friendship while filing reports, experienced real grief at Marina's suffering while documenting it for state security. Human beings contained such contradictions. The informant system depended on it. Thursday would arrive in 2 days. November 11th, Irina would knock on the door at 6 o'clock, holding something small, pastries or sweets, and wearing the expression of friendly warmth that Marina had trusted for 20 years. They would sit at this same table. Marina would pour tea. They would talk about work, about Katya, about Irina's mother, about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. And Marina would perform. She would smile, confide, complain about appropriate topics in appropriate ways. She would give Irina material to report, carefully selected, strategically harmless, designed to satisfy requirements without creating danger. She would become her own informant's handler, feeding information backwards into the system, using Irina the way Irina had used her. But first, she had to master the performance. She practiced in her mind while washing breakfast dishes, while walking Katya to school, while standing at her factory workstation monitoring machinery. The right facial expressions, the proper tone of voice, the balance between openness and caution that would seem natural rather than calculated. It was, Marina realized, the same skill everyone in Soviet society developed, the ability to live multiple truths simultaneously, to say things without meaning them, mean things without saying them, and maintain such perfect control that no one could determine which was which. She had simply been naive enough to believe one relationship existed outside that system. She would not make that mistake again. Thursday evening would be a test of her ability to function in the world as it actually was, rather than the world she had imagined. Marina would pass that test. She was an engineer. She understood systems, processes, mechanisms. The informant network was simply another system to navigate. She would navigate it successfully. And Irina would never know that anything had changed. November 11th, 1976 arrived grey and cold, the way Moscow Thursdays often did in late autumn. Marina had spent the previous 2 days performing normalcy with an attention to detail that exhausted her. She woke at the usual time, prepared Katya's breakfast, walked her daughter to school along the familiar route. At the factory, she reviewed production schedules, adjusted machinery tolerances, attended a brief meeting about material shortages. She spoke when spoken to, smiled at appropriate moments, and gave no indication that her internal world had fractured. But everything had changed. She noticed things she had previously overlooked. The way her neighbor, Mrs. Lebedeva, always seemed to be in the hallway when Marina came home, asking casual questions about Marina's day. How long had she been doing this? Had she always been so interested in Marina's schedule, or was this a recent development? The colleague at work, Dmitri, who possessed remarkable recall for conversations from weeks prior. Was this simply good memory, or something more deliberate? Marina recognized she was sliding toward paranoia. In Soviet society, the line between reasonable caution and destructive suspicion was dangerously thin. Everyone lived with the knowledge that surveillance existed, that careless words could be reported, that trust was a calculated risk. Most people managed this awareness without becoming paralyzed by it. They learned which topics were safe, which people were reliable, how to navigate the system without constant terror. But discovering concrete proof of betrayal from your closest friend recalibrated everything. If Irina, 20 years of shared history, countless intimate conversations, the person who knew Marina better than anyone, if she had been reporting, then who could be trusted? The answer, Marina understood intellectually, was that many people could be trusted. Most people were not informants. Statistical probability suggested the vast majority of her acquaintances were exactly who they appeared to be. Yet knowing this rationally didn't prevent her from reviewing every interaction of the past months with new suspicion. She mentally audited what she had said to whom. The Solzhenitsyn book, she had mentioned it to Irina and to Vera, a university friend she saw occasionally. Had Vera also reported it? Marina's criticism of factory director Kuznetsov, she had complained to several colleagues, not just Irina. Were there multiple files, multiple informants, her life documented from several angles simultaneously? The fear extended beyond herself. Katya was 9 years old, approaching the age when educational tracking would determine her future opportunities. Children of politically unreliable parents faced obstacles, denied university admission, excluded from desirable positions marked by their parents' files. What if Marina's dossier was growing too thick? What if her documented criticisms, her reading of forbidden literature, her questions about alternative possibilities accumulated into a profile that would limit her daughter's life? This fear was sharper than concern for herself. Marina could accept consequences for her own choices and statements. But the thought that her words, spoken in what she believed was private confidence, might harm Katya was unbearable. She had to control this situation. She had to understand its scope and manage the damage. Thursday afternoon, she left work early, claiming a doctor's appointment. At home, she cleaned the apartment thoroughly, a weekly ritual Irina would expect. She prepared tea using the good pot, arranged cookies on a plate, set the table for two. Through these familiar motions, she rehearsed her performance. Natural warmth, but not excessive enthusiasm. Willingness to talk, but avoidance of sensitive topics. The version of herself that Irina knew, replicated precisely. "Is Aunt Irina coming?" Katya asked, looking up from her schoolwork. The question pierced Marina. Her daughter loved Irina, trusted her completely. Katya had no capacity to understand the adult world's complexities, the way people could embody contradiction. To Katya, Aunt Irina was simply Aunt Irina, the woman who brought sweets, played games, listened to stories about school with genuine interest. "Yes, sweetheart, at 6 o'clock, like always. Can I stay up to see her?" "For a little while, then you have bedtime." Marina looked at her daughter's eager face and felt the weight of what she was protecting. Katya's innocence, her ability to trust, her understanding of the world as a place where people meant what they said, and friendship was uncomplicated. Marina would maintain that innocence as long as possible, even if it meant performing a relationship she no longer believed in. The knock came at exactly 6 o'clock. Irina was never late. Marina opened the door to find her friend holding a small bag of ginger snaps from the bakery near her office, Katya's favorite. "Hello," Irina said, smiling. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Never, come in." Marina watched herself step aside, gesture Irina toward the kitchen, take her coat. The movements were automatic, muscle memory from hundreds of previous Thursdays, but her awareness was heightened, analytical. She observed Irina's leather bag, the one that always contained the small notebook. She tracked Irina's eyes as they scanned the apartment, noting details. She listened to Irina's greeting to Katya, warm, affectionate, apparently genuine. They sat at the table. Marina poured tea. Katya showed Irina a drawing she had made at school, and Irina examined it with what seemed like authentic interest, asking questions about the colors and composition. After 15 minutes, Marina sent her daughter to bed, despite protests. "She adores you," Marina said once Katya had gone to the other room. "The feeling is mutual. She's a wonderful child." "I'm lucky." The conversation found its rhythm. Work, always. A safe topic. Irina described bureaucratic frustrations at her planning office, incomprehensible directives from higher administration, paperwork that served no apparent purpose, colleagues who avoided responsibility. Marina offered similar complaints about the factory, carefully calibrated. She mentioned equipment breakdowns without criticizing leadership. She described production challenges without questioning the planned economy's fundamental logic. Irina listened with familiar attentiveness, occasionally asking follow-up questions. "How is the new deputy director working out, the one who replaced Sokolov?" Marina noticed the question's specificity. She didn't recall mentioning the personnel change to Irina. Had she? Or had Irina learned it elsewhere and was now testing Marina's response? "He seems competent enough. I don't work with him directly." That's good. I know you were concerned about leadership after Kuznetsov's decisions earlier this year. There it was, a gentle steering toward Marina's opinions about factory management. Marina recognized the technique now. Irina would reference a previous complaint, inviting Marina to expand on it, perhaps escalate the criticism. Marina would provide quotable material. The material would appear in next week's report. "Oh, that situation resolved itself," Marina said, deflecting. "These things usually do." She changed the subject to Irina's mother, whose health had been declining. Irina's face shifted into genuine worry as she described her mother's increasing frailty, the difficulty finding adequate medical care, her own exhaustion from managing both work and caregiving. Marina listened and found herself feeling authentic sympathy. Whatever else Irina was, she was also a woman struggling with real problems: aging parent, limited resources, the grinding difficulty of Soviet daily life. Was this manipulation? Was Irina's vulnerability calculated to elicit Marina's reciprocal openness? Or were these simply the facts of Irina's existence, coexisting with her role as informant? Marina couldn't determine which, and the uncertainty was maddening. "You're being very strong," Marina said. "Your mother is fortunate to have you." Irina reached across the table and placed her hand on Marina's shoulder. "Thank you." "You understand what it's like, managing everything alone, with Katya, your work, no family support since the divorce. I don't know how you do it." The touch felt warm. The concern in Irina's voice sounded real. Marina looked into her friend's eyes and saw what appeared to be genuine affection. For a moment, she wanted desperately to believe it was all a mistake, that the document had been misfiled, that source Vesna was someone else, that 20 years of friendship meant what she had always believed it meant. But she had read the reports. She had seen her own words, her exact phrases, things only Irina could have known. The evidence was irrefutable. Marina smiled and covered Irina's hand with her own. "We manage because we must. That's what women do, isn't it?" The conversation continued for another hour. They discussed winter preparations, finding warm boots for Katya, the building administration's failure to fix the hot water system, safe topics, domestic concerns, nothing that could be weaponized. Marina had decided on a strategy. She would feed Irina true but trivial information. Complaints about apartment maintenance, worries about Katya's cold, minor frustrations that any Soviet citizen experienced daily, material that would satisfy reporting requirements without creating danger. She also introduced one piece of false information, carefully casual. A colleague mentioned he's thinking of transferring to a factory in Yaroslavl. His wife's family is there. I told him I couldn't imagine leaving Moscow. Even with all its difficulties, this is home. The statement was invented. No colleague was transferring anywhere, but Marina spoke it naturally as throwaway conversation. If this appeared in future reports, she would know Irina documented even mundane details. It would help Marina calibrate what level of caution was necessary. At 8:30, Irina prepared to leave, exactly on schedule. "Same time Sunday? Walk in the park if weather permits?" "Of course. Katya will be disappointed if we don't go." Marina helped Irina with her coat, walked her to the door, embraced her briefly. The physical contact felt surreal, holding someone while knowing they would spend Tuesday evening recounting this conversation to a KGB officer, converting intimacy into intelligence. After Irina left, Marina locked the door and stood in the silent apartment. Katya slept. The Petrovs' television murmured through the wall. Everything appeared exactly as it had before 6 o'clock. But Marina felt hollowed out. The performance had required constant vigilance, every word measured, every expression controlled, 2.5 hours of calculated authenticity. She had succeeded. Irina had shown no sign of suspecting anything had changed. But the effort had been enormous. She thought of the years ahead. How long could she sustain this? How many more Thursday evenings, Sunday walks, casual encounters in hallways and shops? The friendship couldn't be ended abruptly without raising questions about why. Marina was trapped in a relationship that no longer existed except as theatre. She poured herself tea and sat at the table where Irina had sat minutes before. The decision she had postponed for 3 days crystallized now. She needed more information. She needed to understand the full scope of the surveillance, when it had started, what damage had already been done, whether other people in her life were also reporting. She needed proof beyond a single document. She needed to know everything. And that meant she would have to do what felt impossible: maintain this performance indefinitely while simultaneously investigating the system that was investigating her. Live the lie while seeking truth. Trust no one while appearing to trust everyone. Marina finished her tea and began washing the dishes. Outside, Moscow's November darkness was complete. Inside, under fluorescent light in a communal apartment where privacy was structural impossibility, she prepared for a long campaign. The friendship was dead, but its corpse would have to be preserved, animated, made to walk and talk convincingly. She could do this. She was Soviet. She had been trained her entire life for exactly this kind of duplicity. The gap between public performance and private truth, the smile that meant nothing, the words that conveyed everything except what they said. She had simply never imagined she would need these skills with the one person she thought understood her completely. That innocence was gone now. What remained was clarity, cold and complete. Marina dried the dishes and put them away, each movement deliberate and calm. Tomorrow she would continue her investigation. Tonight she would sleep, because even in a surveillance state, exhaustion eventually demanded rest. The performance would resume in the morning, and the morning after that, and every morning until Marina understood exactly what she was fighting and how to survive it. What Marina couldn't know, was that the KGB had been building her file since August 1974, 26 months before she found the report. The file resided in a steel cabinet on the 3rd floor of the Lubyanka building, Moscow's infamous KGB headquarters. Its designation read, Subject 2847M, Engineer, Category 2 Surveillance, Domestic Counterintelligence. The folder was approximately 2 centimeters thick by November 1976, containing intake documentation, background assessments, and 26 monthly reports from Source Vesna. Marina Sokolova had come to the attention of the second chief directorate, responsible for internal security, following her divorce from Alexei Sokolov in July 1974. Alexei was a low-level party functionary, nothing important, but his status meant the divorce required administrative review. During custody proceedings, he had characterized his former wife as emotionally volatile, unreliable in her thinking, susceptible to Western propaganda. Most of this was spite. Alexei was bitter about the marriage's failure and wanted to inflict damage, but his accusations, once entered into official records, triggered protocols. KGB analysts evaluated Marina according to standard risk assessment criteria. She was a divorced woman, automatically categorized as potentially morally unstable, the assumption being that divorce indicated either poor judgment or Western-influenced rejection of Soviet family values. She possessed technical education and worked in an industrial position with access to production data. Her factory manufactured textile machinery, some of which was exported to Eastern Bloc countries. Marina knew production schedules, efficiency metrics, equipment capabilities, information that, while not classified, could interest foreign intelligence services seeking to assess Soviet industrial capacity. The initial assessment, dated August 12, 1974, recommended Category 2 surveillance, passive monitoring through existing informant networks with active measures if suspicious activity emerged. Category 1 would have involved physical surveillance, phone taps, intensive investigation. Category 3 was minimal, occasional checks, no dedicated resources. Marina rated middle-tier concern, worth watching, not worth significant expense. The file needed an informant with regular access to the subject. Standard procedure was to recruit someone from the target's intimate circle, family member, close friend, romantic partner. Marina's social network was limited. Her parents lived in Tula, contact infrequent. Her colleagues at the factory were acquaintances, not confidants. She had one close friend, Irina Volkova. According to documents declassified in 1992, following the Soviet Union's collapse, the approach to Irina occurred on September 3, 1974. She was summoned to a regional KGB office under administrative pretext, routine verification of her employment records. The interview was conducted by Major Yevgeny Petrov, a 15-year veteran specializing in domestic counterintelligence operations. Petrov's personnel file, also declassified, described him as methodical, patient, skilled at psychological pressure. He had recruited 43 informants during his career, with a retention rate above average. His technique involved establishing rapport, demonstrating institutional power, then presenting recruitment as inevitable cooperation rather than betrayal. The interview with Irina lasted 90 minutes. Petrov's report, preserved in the declassified files, noted that she initially resisted. When he explained that her friend Marina was under security review and that Irina could assist by providing routine information, she expressed reluctance to inform on someone she trusted. This was predictable. Most civilians required persuasion. Petrov applied calibrated pressure. He mentioned that Irina's mother, Ekaterina Volkova, had submitted an application for improved housing allocation 2 years prior. The application remained pending. These processes could be accelerated or delayed based on various factors, including the applicant family's cooperation with state security. Additionally, Petrov noted that Irina herself, as an unmarried woman approaching 40, would benefit from her own apartment. Priority housing for single women was rare, but not impossible for those who demonstrated civic responsibility. When incentive proved insufficient, Petrov introduced complication. He referenced Irina's father, deceased since 1969, who had worked in agricultural administration during the Khrushchev era. That period had involved reforms, redistribution of resources, decisions that in retrospect appeared questionable. Petrov suggested that review of her father's conduct might reveal irregularities. Nothing serious, of course, but enough to create difficulties for surviving family members, pension complications, employment obstacles. The choice was clear: cooperate and receive benefits. Refuse and face consequences. Petrov emphasized that the information requested would be harmless. Routine observation of Marina's activities, documentation of her social contacts, reports on her general state of mind, nothing that would harm Marina, everything that would help security services protect her from potential foreign recruitment or ideological deviation. Irina agreed. She signed the informant contract on September 3, 1974, the same day as the interview. Protocol allowed her to choose her own code name from an approved list. She selected Vesna, spring. The file notation offered no explanation for this choice. Perhaps she found it poetic. Perhaps it was random. Training followed immediately. Petrov met with Irina weekly for the first month, instructing her in observation techniques, report structure, cover maintenance. She learned to note specific details, dates, times, exact quotations when possible. She learned to ask clarifying questions without arousing suspicion. She learned to write reports in standardized format, avoiding subjective commentary, focusing on observable facts and documented statements. The quota was established, minimum 2 reports monthly, more during active phases when the subject exhibited concerning behavior. For this work, Irina would receive 45 rubles monthly, approximately half a week's wages for her planning office position. The money was delivered in cash during meetings with Petrov. Additionally, her mother's housing application would be favorably reviewed within 6 months. Irina submitted her first report on September 17, 1974. It described a Thursday evening conversation with Marina about adjustment to divorced life. The report was bland, professional, largely innocuous. It established Irina's access and willingness to document her friends' private statements. Over the following 2 years, Irina's operational file grew steadily. She met with Major Petrov every other Tuesday at 7 o'clock in the evening at a safe house apartment near Kursk station. The apartment was maintained specifically for handler-informant meetings, anonymous, secure, equipped with recording devices should verbal debriefings need documentation. Irina would arrive, deliver her written report or provide verbal summary, answer Petrov's questions and receive instructions for the coming fortnight. Her reports showed evolution. Early submissions focused on Marina's emotional state, her struggles with single motherhood, her financial concerns, mundane material useful for establishing baseline personality profile, but nothing actionable. By mid-1975, Irina was reporting more substantive content, Marina's criticisms of workplace inefficiency, her questions about life in other Soviet cities, her occasional references to alternative political systems, always framed as curiosity rather than endorsement, but noteworthy nonetheless. The gradual escalation was partly natural, Marina's trust deepening, her conversations becoming more candid, and partly cultivated. Petrov instructed Irina to guide discussions towards sensitive topics when possible. Not obviously, not aggressively, but through subtle steering, asking Marina's opinion about recent events, encouraging her to elaborate on frustrations, creating space for Marina to reveal doubts she might otherwise have suppressed. By November 1976, KGB analysts reviewing Marina's file identified patterns of concern. Her criticism of factory management exceeded normal complaints about working conditions. Her interest in forbidden literature, the Solzhenitsyn reference in September, suggested contact with dissident networks or samizdat circulation. Her questions about whether life might be different elsewhere indicated dissatisfaction with Soviet system. Nothing rose to arrest level. Marina hadn't attempted to contact foreign nationals, hadn't distributed anti-Soviet materials, hadn't organized opposition activities. But the trajectory warranted continued monitoring. The analyst's assessment, dated October 28, 1976, recommended maintaining current surveillance protocols while expanding investigation of Marina's social contacts. Who had given her the forbidden book? Did she discuss political topics with colleagues beyond Irina? Was her ex-husband Alexei still involved in her life? And might his party position provide intelligence about her activities? None of this was known to Marina as she sat in her apartment on Friday, November 12th, planning her own investigation. She understood she was being watched, but not the specific mechanisms, the timeline, the institutional perspective that classified her as Category 2 risk. She didn't know about Major Petrov, the safe house near Kursk station, the careful cultivation of Irina's reporting over 26 months. What Marina did know was that she needed information. Thursday's performance with Irina had succeeded, but one evening proved nothing. She needed to understand the full scope of surveillance. Were others also reporting? What had Irina documented over the years? Most critically, what damage had already been done? She began methodically. First, she reviewed her own behavior with forensic attention. Every conversation she could remember from the past 2 years, assessed for potential risk. The forbidden book was serious. Reading samizdat could justify arrest under Article 70 of the Criminal Code, anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. But she had only mentioned it to Irina and one other person, Vera, from university. Had Vera also reported it? Marina needed to test this. Second, she analyzed patterns in her life. Who asked too many questions? Who remembered too much? Who appeared at convenient moments, seemingly by chance, but perhaps by design? Mrs. Lebedeva, the neighbor, remained suspicious, but suspicion wasn't proof. Marina needed evidence. Third, she established protocols for controlling information flow. She would feed different details to different people, tracking whether information surfaced elsewhere. If she told Irina one thing and Vera something else, she could trace which version appeared in consequences, questions from supervisors, interest from authorities. It was intelligence work in reverse. Marina would become her own counterintelligence operation, investigating the system that investigated her. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was mimicking exactly the techniques being used against her, turning surveillance culture back on itself. But she was one person, working alone, with limited resources and enormous risk. The KGB was an institution with decades of experience, thousands of officers, comprehensive files, legal authority to destroy anyone they chose. Marina's investigation was asymmetric warfare, an individual against apparatus. Still, she had advantages. She knew she was being watched, but they didn't know she knew. She could control what Irina learned, which meant controlling what the KGB learned through Irina. She could be strategic where they expected her to be transparent. Marina pulled out a notebook, not to write anything incriminating, but to organize her thinking. She created mental categories: confirmed surveillance, Irina; suspected surveillance, others; unknown factors, additional informants; technical monitoring, file contents. Each category required different investigative approach. For Irina, the strategy was management: continue the friendship, feed controlled information, gather intelligence about meeting schedules and reporting patterns. For suspected surveillance, the approach was testing: introduce false information, observe consequences. For unknown factors, she needed external data points, conversations with people she trusted, careful probing for information about KGB procedures, anything that might illuminate how the system operated. It would take months, possibly years. Marina accepted this. She was an engineer. She understood that complex problems required patience, systematic analysis, incremental progress. She would approach her situation the same way she approached machinery failures at the factory: identify components, test hypotheses, isolate variables, determine solutions. The difference was that failure here meant not mechanical breakdown, but potentially arrest, imprisonment, separation from her daughter. The stakes transformed methodology into survival strategy. Marina closed the notebook and returned it to her bag. Nothing was written down. Everything remained in her head, where it couldn't be discovered, couldn't be reported, couldn't be used against her. Outside, Moscow's winter darkness had settled completely. Inside the Lubyanka building, 3 kilometers from Marina's apartment, her file rested in its steel cabinet, waiting for the next report from Source Vesna. The investigation of Marina Sokolova continued, routine and methodical, one subject among thousands. And now, Marina Sokolova's investigation of her investigators had begun as well. Marina spent the next 2 weeks planning a confrontation she would ultimately never initiate. Between November 12th and 26th, she constructed and dismantled arguments, rehearsed accusations, imagined responses. She wrote nothing down. The apartment was potentially unsafe, any written evidence catastrophically dangerous. But the confrontation lived in her mind, evolving through countless iterations. Each version began the same way: "I know what you've been doing." Each ended differently, with Irina's tears, denials, justifications, silence. But before confrontation, Marina needed certainty. The document provided overwhelming evidence, yet she was a methodical person. She required comprehensive understanding before action. Her strategy crystallized: gather additional proof, map the surveillance network, determine the full scope, then decide. She began testing the information chain. On Thursday, November 18th, during their evening tea, Marina mentioned casually that a colleague named Andrei was considering applying for emigration to join family in Israel. She expressed sympathy for his situation: elderly parents abroad, difficult decision, uncertain process. The story was fabricated. No such colleague existed. No emigration application was pending. Marina had invented the entire narrative as a tracer element. Emigration applications triggered automatic security investigations. If Irina reported this conversation, KGB protocols would require verification. Someone at Marina's factory would be questioned about Andrei. Marina would hear about it through workplace gossip or notice increased scrutiny around the fictitious case. She waited. The following Tuesday, Marina's supervisor, Comrade Volkov, requested a brief meeting. Nothing unusual. He asked about production efficiency reports she had submitted the previous month. But during the conversation, he inquired generally about workplace morale, whether Marina had concerns about any colleagues, whether she had observed unusual behavior or heard troubling conversations. The questions were vague enough to seem routine, but their timing, 4 days after Marina's invented emigration story, suggested connection. The KGB had likely contacted Volkov asking about personnel reliability. They hadn't mentioned Andrei specifically. Marina had deliberately kept the name ambiguous, perhaps mishearing it as Anatoly or Alexander. The security services were probing generally, unable to identify a specific target from Marina's vague description. This confirmed 2 critical facts. First, Irina was reporting with remarkable speed. The conversation Thursday evening, report delivered by the following Tuesday at latest. Second, Marina's information was being acted upon, investigated, treated as credible intelligence. Marina refined her understanding. Irina probably met with her handler every other Tuesday based on the timing. Reports were submitted then, analyzed within days, actionable intelligence forwarded to relevant departments. The system operated efficiently, converting private conversations into institutional action within 1 week. Armed with this knowledge, Marina grew more sophisticated. She understood now that she couldn't stop the surveillance, but she could manage it. Control what Irina learned, thereby controlling what the KGB learned. Feed them information that was true but meaningless, concerning but not actionable, enough to satisfy reporting requirements without creating actual danger. Sunday, November 21st, brought the scheduled walk in Gorky Park. Marina dressed Katya in layers against the cold, coat, scarf, mittens, and met Irina at the park's entrance. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, transforming Moscow into temporary beauty. The park was crowded with families enjoying the weekend, children sledding on small hills, couples walking arm in arm. Katya ran ahead immediately, delighted by the snow. She called back to them, her voice bright with happiness. "Mama! Aunt Irina, look how deep it is!" Irina waved, smiling. She turned to Marina. "She's growing so fast. Soon she won't want to spend Sundays with boring adults." "She adores you, you know that." They walked in silence for a moment, watching Katya make snow angels, her small body creating patterns in the white surface. Irina's expression was tender, unguarded. When Katya called her over to admire the angel, Irina went immediately, crouching beside the girl, praising her work, helping her stand without disturbing the shape. Marina observed this interaction from a few meters away. Irina held Katya's hand, brushed snow from her coat with genuine care, listened attentively as Katya explained her plans for building a snow fort. The affection appeared absolutely authentic. Irina loved this child, that much seemed undeniable, which raised impossible questions. Could someone betray a friend while genuinely caring for that friend's daughter? Could affection and treachery coexist in the same person, directed at the same family? Marina had been operating under the assumption that Irina's entire friendship was performance. But watching her with Katya now, she wondered if human psychology was more complex than that binary. Perhaps Irina truly loved both Marina and Katya, while simultaneously reporting on them. Perhaps she rationalized her role as protection, believing that by controlling Marina's file, feeding relatively harmless information, she prevented worse surveillance by less sympathetic informants. Perhaps Irina had convinced herself she was helping rather than harming, that her reports kept Marina safe by making her seem ordinary, not threatening. Or perhaps this was Marina projecting impossible nuance onto straightforward betrayal. Perhaps Irina's warmth toward Katya was simply operational thoroughness. Perhaps everything was calculation. Marina would never know. This uncertainty was perhaps worse than knowing Irina was purely malicious. Malice could be confronted, rejected, escaped, but this ambiguity, the possibility that betrayal and love coexisted, that Irina genuinely cared while destroying what she claimed to cherish, this was harder to process. At home that evening, after Katya was asleep, Marina returned to her mental confrontation speech. She had refined it over the week, sharpened the accusations, imagined every possible response. I know you've been reporting on me to the KGB. I found a surveillance summary, your source Vesna. For 2 years you've documented everything I've said, turned our friendship into an intelligence operation. I want to know why. I want to know if any of it was real. I want to know how you live with yourself. She imagined Irina's denial. I don't know what you're talking about. Someone is lying to you, trying to destroy our friendship. But the denial would collapse under evidence. Marina could produce the document, force Irina to confront proof. She imagined Irina's confession. I had no choice. They threatened my mother, my job, everything. I tried to protect you by reporting harmless things. I thought I was helping. This version felt plausible. It would complicate Marina's anger, introduce pity and understanding she didn't want to feel. She imagined Irina's justification. I was doing my duty. You make questionable statements, read forbidden materials, criticize the party. It's my responsibility to report this. You're the one who should explain yourself. This version was hardest to face. The possibility that Irina genuinely believed she was right, that ideology trumped friendship, that state security justified any betrayal. Marina drafted and redrafted the confrontation in her mind for days, but as November 25th approached, Thanksgiving Thursday in America, though that meant nothing in Soviet Russia, just another Thursday, she reached a conclusion. Confrontation served no purpose. It wouldn't change the past. 26 months of surveillance had occurred. Reports existed in files at Lubyanka. Nothing Marina said to Irina could erase that reality. Confrontation wouldn't stop future surveillance. If anything, it would intensify it. The KGB would know their informant had been compromised, would deploy other methods, possibly escalate Marina's security classification. More practically, confronting Irina meant revealing that Marina possessed the document. This raised dangerous questions. How had she acquired classified KGB materials? Why hadn't she reported finding them? Was she planning to use them for anti-Soviet purposes? The document's presence in her apartment, if acknowledged, transformed her from surveillance subject to potential criminal. Outrage was a luxury Marina could not afford. She had a daughter to protect, a life to preserve. Confrontation would satisfy her emotional need for answers, for justice, for recognition of the harm done. But it would accomplish nothing strategic. It would be self-indulgence at potentially catastrophic cost. The rational choice was clear. Maintain the friendship. control the information flow, turn Irina from threat into asset, use the surveillance network against itself by feeding it exactly what Marina wanted it to receive. Harmless complaints, ordinary frustrations, the thoughts of a loyal Soviet citizen struggling with daily life, but fundamentally reliable. Marina could make herself boring. She could perform political orthodoxies so convincingly that her file became routine, uninteresting, eventually deprioritized. She could protect herself and Katya by becoming exactly what the system wanted: compliant, unremarkable, safe. The emotional cost was enormous. She would carry the knowledge of betrayal forever, unable to speak it, unable to resolve it. She would perform friendship with someone who had destroyed trust. She would smile at Irina, confide calculated information, maintain intimacy that was now purely strategic. The person she had been, someone who believed in authentic relationships, who trusted deeply, who valued honesty, that person had to die. What remained was someone harder, more calculating, more Soviet. Marina had resisted this transformation her entire adult life. She had tried to maintain authenticity within a system that demanded performance. She had believed that in private relationships, especially with Irina, she could be genuinely herself. That belief was naive. The system penetrated everywhere. There was no private sphere. There was only surveillance and counter-surveillance, information and counter-information, the endless game of appearing while concealing. Thursday evening, November 25th, arrived. Irina knocked at 6 o'clock, carrying a small bag of chocolates. They sat at the table, poured tea, talked about weather, work, Katya's progress in school. Marina mentioned minor frustrations, a delayed delivery of materials at the factory, concern about rising food prices, exhaustion from the approaching winter darkness, all true, all trivial, all carefully selected to satisfy Irina's reporting obligations without providing anything actionable. Irina listened with familiar attention. She asked follow-up questions, she offered sympathy. She appeared, in every observable way, to be a caring friend. Perhaps she was. Perhaps this was the deepest tragedy, that both versions were true simultaneously, that Irina genuinely cared while genuinely betraying, that human psychology could accommodate such contradiction without visible strain. At 8:30, Irina left. Marina closed the door and stood in the silent apartment, feeling the weight of permanent performance settling onto her shoulders. Some truths were too dangerous to speak. Some betrayals were too costly to address. Some relationships had to continue as ghosts of themselves, maintained because ending them was more dangerous than enduring them. She would never confront Irina. The words would remain unspoken, the accusations unmade, the questions unanswered. This was survival. This was the price of living in a system where trust was weaponized and friendship was infrastructure for control. Marina returned to the table and gathered the teacups. Through the window, Moscow spread dark and vast, containing millions of people engaged in similar calculations, carrying similar secrets, performing similar roles. She was not unique. Her situation was crushingly ordinary. This was simply how life worked in the world she inhabited. The confrontation that never happened remained a phantom in her mind, a parallel possibility existing alongside the reality she had chosen. Sometimes, in quiet moments over the coming years, she would imagine finally speaking the words, finally demanding answers. But she never would. The performance would continue. The friendship would persist as elaborate theater. And Marina would learn to live with knowledge that could never become speech, with truth that had to remain forever silent. By December 1976, two versions of the same friendship existed simultaneously, like quantum states that could not collapse without destroying everything. Marina lived both versions every day. In one, she was Irina's closest friend, confidant of 20 years, the person who shared struggles and small joys over Thursday evening tea. In the other, she was a counterintelligence operator managing an asset, controlling information flow, performing a role with calculated precision. Both versions were real, both required absolute commitment. Neither could acknowledge the other's existence. Winter settled over Moscow with characteristic severity. The city disappeared under snow and darkness, the brief daylight hours grey and insufficient. Marina's routine continued unchanged in its outward form: work at the factory, caring for Katya, Thursday evenings with Irina, occasional Sunday walks when weather permitted. But everything had been weaponized with knowledge. She established rules for herself, boundaries that would keep her safe while maintaining credible authenticity. Never discuss work beyond surface complaints about conditions. Never mention colleagues by full name or provide identifying details. Never reference foreign contacts, even hypothetical ones. Never criticize party leadership beyond the mild grumbling any Soviet citizen might offer about bureaucratic inefficiency. Never, under any circumstances, mention books, ideas, or conversations that strayed toward forbidden territory. Instead, Marina fed Irina carefully selected harmless content. Domestic frustrations became her primary material: the building's heating failures, difficulty finding decent winter boots for Katya, neighbors who played music too loudly. She invented romantic disappointments, mentioning a man from the factory who had seemed interested but turned out to be married, expressing loneliness but not desperation. She shared parenting struggles, Katya's occasional defiance, worries about her daughter's education, exhaustion from managing everything alone. These secrets were intimate enough to seem genuine while being utterly safe. They gave Irina material to report, satisfied whatever quota existed for monthly submissions, and portrayed Marina as an ordinary Soviet woman navigating ordinary difficulties. The KGB file would show someone tired, struggling, but fundamentally unremarkable, exactly what Marina intended. What Marina couldn't know, wouldn't learn until years later after the Soviet Union's collapse, was Irina's perspective during this same period. In 1994, researchers conducting oral histories with former informants interviewed Irina Volkova in Voronezh, where she had moved following her mother's death. The transcript, preserved in newly opened archives, revealed her growing unease during 1976 and 1977. She described her dual role as living in two realities at once, neither completely real. "I told myself I was protecting her," Irina stated in the interview. "If I reported harmless things, her frustration with heating, her loneliness, her worry about Katya, then they would be satisfied. They wouldn't send someone else, someone who might report the more dangerous conversations we'd had in earlier years. I convinced myself I was helping." The interviewer asked whether she truly believed this rationalization. "Sometimes," Irina replied. "Other times I knew it was cowardice disguised as protection. But we were all cowards then. The system made cowards of everyone." She acknowledged genuine affection coexisting with betrayal. "I loved Marina. I loved Katya. This wasn't performance. But I also reported on them, documented their lives, turned intimacy into intelligence. Human beings can hold contradictions that should be impossible. That's what I learned. Neither woman could have articulated this to the other during those months. They lived parallel existences, each performing for the other, each protecting secrets the other didn't know she was keeping. New Year's Eve, 1976, arrived. Marina, Irina, and Katya celebrated together in Marina's apartment, a tradition they had maintained for years. They watched the television broadcast from Red Square, toasted with cheap champagne at midnight, exchanged small gifts. Katya received a book from Irina, approved children's literature about Soviet heroes. Marina gave Irina a scarf she had saved for months to afford. They embraced, wished each other health and happiness in the coming year. The evening felt simultaneously genuine and utterly false. Marina experienced real warmth alongside her knowledge of Irina's surveillance. She wondered if Irina would report this celebration, and if so, what details she would include. The champagne? Was it evidence of Marina's access to scarce goods, suggesting black market connections? The conversation about hopes for 1977, would casual optimism be interpreted as political reliability or naivete? Katya's 9th birthday came in January. Irina brought a cake, played games with delighted children from the building, helped clean up afterward. Marina watched her friend with her daughter and saw genuine tenderness. Irina wasn't pretending to love Katya. The affection was real. Yet Irina would still report details from the party, still document who attended, still note anything Marina said that deviated from perfect orthodoxy. The strange intimacy of Marina's position became almost unbearable. She knew something Irina didn't know. That Marina knew. This created asymmetry in every interaction. When Irina asked seemingly innocent questions, Marina heard the intelligence gathering beneath them. When Irina offered sympathy, Marina calculated whether to accept it as genuine or reject it as manipulation. Marina never let Katya suspect anything was wrong. Her daughter continued calling Irina Aunt Irina, continued running to embrace her when she arrived, continued trusting absolutely. Marina protected this innocence fiercely. Katya was 9 years old. She couldn't understand the adult world's compromises and betrayals. She deserved some space free from surveillance culture's poison. But maintaining Katya's innocence required constant vigilance. Marina had to prevent her daughter from overhearing certain conversations, from noticing her mother's occasional wariness around Irina, from sensing the performance underlying their Thursday evenings. Children were perceptive. The effort of hiding truth from Katya, while hiding different truth from Irina, exhausted Marina in ways her factory work never could. Spring 1977 brought changes beyond seasonal warming. The political climate shifted, becoming more paranoid and restrictive. The Carter administration in America had made human rights a foreign policy priority, creating pressure on the Soviet government. In response, KGB directives emphasized enhanced monitoring of intelligentsia who might be influenced by Western propaganda about freedom and democracy. Marina learned about these changes indirectly through subtle shifts in her environment. Security checks at the factory became more frequent. Workplace meetings devoted more time to ideological education. The general atmosphere tightened, became more suspicious. Irina's behavior changed as well. Her questions became more pointed, less casual. During a Thursday evening in March, she asked about Marina's colleagues at the factory, specifically their political views, whether Marina had heard anyone express admiration for Western systems or criticism of Soviet governance. Marina deflected carefully. We mostly talk about work, production schedules, equipment problems, nothing political. But surely there are discussions sometimes, people's opinions about leadership, about policies. If there are, I'm not part of them. I keep my head down and do my job. This was the correct answer, the response of someone aware that political discussions were dangerous and avoided them accordingly. But it was also evasive enough to suggest Marina might be hiding something which could trigger further probing. Irina shifted tactics. Have you heard any foreign radio broadcast lately? BBC, Voice of America? Marina met her eyes. Why would I do that? It's forbidden. I know, I'm just asking. Some people listen out of curiosity, not disloyalty. I don't. I have enough to worry about without inviting trouble. The exchange was a close call. Irina was fishing for admissions pressed by her handler to obtain more substantive intelligence. Marina recognized the pressure. Later testimony from 1994 confirmed it. Major Petrov had told Irina that Marina's file needed better content, that reports about heating complaints and romantic disappointments weren't sufficient for continued surveillance justification. He said they would close the case and remove me as informant unless I provided better material, Irina recalled in her interview. But Marina had become more careful, or maybe she had always been careful and I simply hadn't noticed. Either way, I couldn't give him what he wanted without inventing things, and I wasn't willing to fabricate reports that could actually harm her. In April, Irina asked about a colleague Marina had mentioned months earlier, someone Marina had criticized for incompetence. Irina wanted to know if Marina still held that opinion, if the person's work had improved, if Marina had discussed this with others. Marina responded immediately. "I think I was wrong about that. I was frustrated that day and said things I didn't mean. Actually, he's quite competent. I misjudged the situation." The reversal was strategic. If the colleague was under investigation based on Marina's earlier comment reported by Irina, this new statement would contradict the file. It would make Marina seem unreliable as a source of information, someone whose judgments shifted arbitrarily. It might also protect the colleague, whoever he was, from consequences of Marina's careless earlier criticism. Irina accepted the explanation without pressing further. But Marina noticed a flicker of something in her friend's expression. Frustration, perhaps, or recognition that Marina was becoming harder to access. The psychological toll mounted for both women, though in different ways. Marina lived with constant vigilance, measuring every word, calculating every disclosure, maintaining performance across all aspects of her life. The effort created a kind of permanent tension, muscles that couldn't fully relax, even in sleep. For Irina, according to her later testimony, the burden was guilt. "I started dreading our Thursday evenings," she admitted in 1994. "Not because I didn't want to see her, but because I knew what I would do afterward. The worst part was that she still trusted me, or seemed to. I would leave her apartment and go directly to report on everything she'd said. The betrayal became harder to justify even to myself." Neither woman could afford honesty. The truth would destroy everything: their friendship, Marina's security, possibly Irina's freedom if she confessed to her role. So they continued the performance Thursday after Thursday, season after season, both aware the situation was unsustainable, but unable to imagine how it might end. The friendship had become a mutual hostage situation. Marina couldn't escape without revealing her knowledge, which was dangerous. Irina couldn't escape without confessing her role, which was impossible. They were locked together in a dance of duplicity, each leading and following simultaneously, both waiting for some external force to break the terrible equilibrium. By late spring 1977, 6 months after Marina found the document behind her radiator, the two versions of their friendship had calcified into permanent parallel existence. They would continue this way for years, perhaps forever. Some contradictions never resolved, some truths never emerged into speech, some relationships existed only as performance, sustained by necessity rather than choice, authentic in their inauthenticity. Marina understood this with cold clarity. The friendship she had believed in was dead. What remained was its corpse, animated by fear and calculation, performing the gestures of intimacy without the substance. She had become expert at this animation, so skilled that even she sometimes forgot she was pretending. But the forgetting never lasted. Reality reasserted itself every Thursday evening when Irina left, and Marina was alone again, free temporarily from performance, confronting the knowledge she could never speak and the betrayal she could never address. This was survival. This was Soviet life distilled to its essence. and Marina would continue it as long as necessary because the alternative, truth, was a luxury more dangerous than any lie. On March 14th, 1977, at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, Marina received news that would force her hand. She was summoned from the factory floor to the administrative offices, a rare occurrence that immediately triggered anxiety. The director's secretary gestured her toward Comrade Volkov's office without explanation. Marina wiped machine oil from her hands and tried to calm the acceleration of her heartbeat. Volkov sat behind his desk, a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the bureaucratic manner of someone who had survived decades by avoiding decisions. He gestured for Marina to sit. "Comrade Sokolova, I have good news. You're being considered for promotion to senior engineer. Your work has been exemplary, your technical knowledge is strong, and the position requires someone with your capabilities." Marina's first reaction was relief. This wasn't arrest or accusation. Her second was immediate understanding of what the promotion actually meant. "Thank you, Comrade Director. I'm honored to be considered." The promotion requires a security review, standard procedure for positions with access to sensitive production data, background check, interviews with colleagues and associates, verification of political reliability. Nothing to be concerned about if your record is clean. He said this as reassurance. Marina heard threat. "Of course, I understand. The review will begin in approximately 2 weeks. You should expect visits from security personnel. Be cooperative, answer their questions truthfully, and there should be no complications." Marina left his office with her mind already racing through implications. A security review meant her entire file would be examined in detail, cross-referenced with statements from neighbors, colleagues, anyone who knew her. KGB analysts would look for inconsistencies, differences between what she had said privately and what she claimed publicly, contradictions suggesting duplicity or hidden political unreliability. The danger was immediate and multifaceted. Over the past 4 months, Marina had carefully controlled information flow to Irina, feeding her specific narratives while behaving differently at work and in other contexts. What if these created visible discrepancies? What if investigators noticed that Marina's file contained reports about concerns she had never expressed to colleagues or complaints about people she praised in workplace settings? Worse, Marina had deliberately fed Irina false information during her testing phase. The fabricated story about a colleague considering emigration, other small inventions designed to trace information flow. If security investigators discovered these lies in her file and questioned her about them, she would have to explain why she had discussed fictional events. The KGB's interpretation would be immediate. Marina knew she was under surveillance and was attempting counterintelligence activity. This was far more serious than ordinary political unreliability. Marina had perhaps 2 weeks before interviews began. She calculated her options methodically. Option 1, refuse the promotion. Claim she was uninterested in additional responsibility, preferred her current position, wanted more time with her daughter. This would avoid the security review, but would itself seem suspicious. Why would someone turn down advancement? What did she have to hide? Refusing might trigger investigation regardless. Option 2, accept the promotion and attempt to manage the investigation as it unfolded. Answer questions carefully, explain away any discrepancies, perform political reliability convincingly. Risky, but potentially manageable if her file wasn't too problematic. Option 3, preemptive action. Change her circumstances before the investigation began, create a narrative that explained potential contradictions and reduced Irina's access to future intelligence. Marina chose option 3. She needed to distance herself from Irina in a way that appeared natural, not suspicious. The friendship couldn't end dramatically. That would raise questions about what had caused the rupture. But it could cool gradually, drift apart through minor conflicts that neighbors and investigators would find plausible. She spent 3 days planning the engineering of their separation. The conflict had to be public enough to be witnessed, establishing a timeline before the security review. It had to concern something emotionally significant but politically neutral. It had to cause genuine hurt. Irina's reaction had to be authentic for the performance to convince observers. Thursday, March 17th, Irina arrived as usual at 6 o'clock. Marina had positioned the encounter carefully. Mrs. Lebedeva, the neighbor, was in the communal kitchen preparing dinner. The Petrovs were home. Several other building residents would be within earshot of raised voices. The conversation began normally: tea, pleasantries, discussion of Katya's schoolwork. Then Irina, genuinely trying to be helpful, offered advice about Katya's education. "I was thinking," Irina said, "that Katya might benefit from additional mathematics tutoring. She's bright, but the school curriculum is demanding. There's a program through the Komsomol for children showing academic promise. I could help arrange enrollment." This was thoughtful, well-intentioned, exactly what a caring friend would suggest. Marina used it as the trigger she had been waiting for. "I don't need you to arrange my daughter's education." The sharpness in her voice was calculated. Irina looked up, surprised. "I was just trying to help. I know you worry about her schooling." "You know what I worry about because I tell you. That doesn't make you her parent. You don't have children. You don't understand what it means to make these decisions." Marina heard her own cruelty and pushed through it. This had to wound. Irina's unmarried, childless status was her deepest insecurity. Marina was deliberately striking at the most vulnerable point. Irina's face went pale. "I've helped raise Katya. I've been there since she was born. I thought—" "You've been helpful. That doesn't make you her mother. I appreciate your concern, but I'll make decisions about her future without your interference." The word interference landed like a slap. Marina saw Irina flinch. She forced herself to continue, raising her voice slightly so it would carry beyond the apartment walls. "Maybe it's easier to have opinions about raising children when you don't have the actual responsibility, when you can just visit on Thursdays and leave when things get difficult." "That's not fair, Marina. I love Katya. I've always tried to support you both." "Support is different from control. I don't need you managing my daughter's life." Irina stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Her eyes were wet, her hands shaking slightly. The hurt was absolutely genuine. Marina had calculated correctly. The wound was deep enough to create authentic reaction. "I should go," Irina said quietly. "Perhaps that's best." Irina gathered her coat, her movements stiff with suppressed emotion. She paused at the door, seemed about to speak, then simply left. The door closed with controlled quietness, Irina maintaining dignity even in her hurt. Marina sat at the table, her own hands trembling now that the performance was complete. She had just deliberately destroyed someone she had once loved. The fact that the love was already destroyed by prior betrayal didn't make the cruelty easier. She had weaponized Irina's deepest pain, turned friendship's intimate knowledge into ammunition. From the hallway, she heard Mrs. Lebedeva's voice speaking to someone, too quiet to distinguish words, but the tone suggested gossip being shared. Perfect. The argument had witnesses. By tomorrow, the entire building would know that Marina and Irina had fought, that their close friendship had ruptured over parenting disagreements. The following weeks proceeded according to Marina's design. She and Irina passed each other in hallways with cool nods, no longer stopping to talk. Sunday walks were discontinued. The next Thursday came and went without Irina's visit. When they encountered each other at the building entrance 2 weeks later, Irina attempted tentative conversation, asking about Katya, whether Marina was well, and Marina responded with polite brevity. Not hostile, just distant. The warmth was gone. By April, their Thursday evenings had become bi-weekly, the conversations superficial and brief. By May, they were meeting only monthly, more from habit than genuine connection. Irina's face when they passed each other showed confusion and pain. She clearly didn't understand what she had done to deserve such complete rejection. Marina occasionally wanted to explain, to alleviate Irina's suffering by revealing the truth. But explanation was impossible. The distance had to be maintained. The security investigation proceeded through April and May. Investigators interviewed Marina's colleagues, her neighbors, people who knew her socially. They asked about her political reliability, her personal relationships, her character. Marina presented a carefully constructed narrative. She was a dedicated worker, loyal Soviet citizen, devoted mother. Her friendship with Irina Volkova had been close, but had drifted apart naturally due to disagreements about parenting approaches. These things happened. No dramatic rupture, just gradual cooling of a relationship that had run its course. Mrs. Lebedeva confirmed the argument she had overheard in March. Other neighbors noted that Irina's visits had become less frequent. The timeline supported Marina's narrative of natural separation rather than sudden suspicious break. Marina's file, presumably, would reflect this change. Irina's reports to Major Petrov would note the distance, the reduced access, the cooling friendship. Perhaps Irina would recommend that surveillance be reduced or reassigned to other sources. Perhaps Marina's case would be deprioritized, classified as low concern, filed away in some cabinet at Lubyanka among thousands of other ordinary citizens whose files documented ordinary lives. The promotion was approved in June. Marina became senior engineer with increased responsibilities and marginally better compensation. The security review found nothing problematic. She was deemed reliable. But the cost of this security was the final destruction of a friendship already killed by betrayal. Marina had now participated actively in its death, had wielded the knife herself instead of simply discovering the wound. She had been cruel deliberately, strategically. She had hurt someone who, whatever else she was, had also loved Katya genuinely and supported Marina through difficult years. The system had forced this choice. Marina's need to protect herself and her daughter had required sacrificing what remained of relationship already poisoned. She told herself this was Irina's fault, that the informant role had created the necessity for distance, that Marina was simply responding to circumstances Irina had initiated. But late at night, unable to sleep, Marina wondered if she had become something she had never intended to be, someone capable of calculating cruelty, someone who used intimate knowledge as weapon, someone who had learned the system's methods too well and was now indistinguishable from it. She had survived. She had protected Katya. She had secured her position. These were victories, perhaps the only victories available in her situation. But they tasted like ash. And the distance between who Marina had been and who she had become seemed, in those dark hours, almost as great as the distance between friendship's promise and its betrayal. The question of responsibility in cases like this is complicated. June 1977 brought Marina's promotion to senior engineer, her security clearance approved without complication. The investigation had found her reliable, politically sound, suitable for positions requiring trust. She accepted the promotion with appropriate gratitude, aware that it had cost her the last remnants of a friendship already destroyed by betrayal she couldn't acknowledge. The relationship with Irina continued in attenuated form, superficial neighborly exchanges, brief greetings when they passed on stairs, occasional polite conversations at building meetings about heating repairs or garbage collection schedules. The Thursday evenings ended completely by autumn. Sunday walks became memories. 20 years of shared history reduced to the performance of acquaintanceship between women who lived in the same building but inhabited different worlds. Marina grieved privately for what was lost, not for Irina as she actually was, informant, reporter of confidences, instrument of surveillance, but for who Marina had believed her to be. She mourned the friend who had never truly existed, the relationship she had trusted completely. The person still lived across the courtyard, visible through windows, encountered in hallways, but the friendship was dead, killed twice, first by Irina's betrayal, then by Marina's strategic cruelty. They maintained the performance indefinitely because neither could afford truth. Irina couldn't confess her role without facing consequences. Legal prosecution was unlikely, but social destruction was certain. Marina couldn't reveal her knowledge without explaining how she had acquired a classified KGB document. The silence between them became permanent, a gap filled with everything that could never be spoken. This story was not unique. Across the Soviet Union, millions of similar betrayals occurred, friends informing on friends, spouses reporting on spouses, children documenting parents' statements. Estimates vary, but historians suggest that during the Brezhnev era, 1 in 20 to 40 adults participated in surveillance networks. The mathematics of this created pervasive uncertainty. Any gathering, any conversation, any moment of confidence potentially included someone who would transform intimacy into intelligence. The system's genius lay in making everyone complicit. Not everyone was an informant, but anyone might be. This possibility poisoned trust systematically, made authentic relationship nearly impossible. Those who were informants rationalized their participation through ideology, fear, or material necessity. Those who weren't lived with constant awareness that they might be observed. The surveillance culture created subjects and objects interchangeably, everyone simultaneously watcher and watched. Could Irina be blamed for choices made under coercion? The KGB had offered incentives and implied threats. She had a vulnerable mother, limited prospects, genuine fears about security. Her recruitment was coercive, though not violently so. She could have refused, accepted consequences, maintained integrity at significant cost. She chose otherwise. Was this moral failure or rational survival? Could Marina be blamed for her strategic cruelty in engineering their separation? She had deliberately wounded Irina, weaponized intimate knowledge of her deepest insecurities, performed calculated betrayal to protect herself. The cruelty was defensive, self-preserving, arguably necessary. But necessity didn't erase the harm. Marina had become capable of precisely the kind of instrumental use of relationship that she condemned in the system itself. There were no villains in this story. Only victims of different kinds making impossible choices within impossible constraints. The tragedy existed at the systemic level, a society organized around mutual surveillance where trust became liability and intimacy invited exploitation. Years passed. Gorbachev came to power in 1985, introducing glasnost and perestroika. The Soviet system began its slow collapse, though no one recognized this initially. Marina and Irina still lived in the same building, still maintained polite distance. Occasionally, Marina wondered if glasnost's new openness might create space for conversation, for some kind of reckoning, but the moment never arrived. The habits of silence were too deeply established. December 1991 brought the Soviet Union's formal dissolution. The KGB was disbanded, reorganized, its archives theoretically opened to public examination. Citizens could request their files, learn who had informed on them, confront documented evidence of surveillance. Many did. Marina chose not to. What purpose would it serve? She already knew the essential truth, reading detailed reports of her conversations, seeing her life documented across years of Irina's observations. This would only deepen wounds that had scarred over, but never healed. Some truths were not worth confirming. Building residents reported that Irina attempted to contact Marina in 1993, leaving a letter that went unanswered. Marina never discussed whether she received it or what it might have said. When asked years later why she hadn't responded, she simply said, "The past cannot be undone. Words couldn't change what happened." Irina moved to Voronezh in 1995 to care for her dying mother, the same mother whose housing needs had been leveraged for Irina's recruitment 21 years earlier. Marina learned this from neighbors. The two women never spoke directly after their engineered argument in March 1977. 18 years of living in the same building without meaningful contact, a silence more eloquent than any conversation could have been. Katya learned the truth about Aunt Irina in the late 1990s, when she was in her 30s, married with children of her own. Marina finally explained what had happened, the surveillance, the betrayal, the document behind the radiator, the years of performance. Katya's initial incomprehension gave way to understanding as Marina described the Soviet system's mechanisms, the impossibility of trust, the choices that seemed unimaginable to those who hadn't lived through that period. "How could she do that to you?" Katya asked. "How could the system make that seem rational?" Marina replied. Those are different questions with different answers. In 2003, researchers conducting oral histories about Soviet surveillance culture interviewed Marina Sokolova. She was 61 years old, retired from the textile factory, living in the same apartment where she had found the document 27 years earlier. She refused to characterize Irina definitively as either traitor or victim. "We were both trapped," Marina stated. "She chose one way to survive, I chose another. The system created the trap. Individual choices within that trap, I don't know how to judge them. I'm not even sure judgment is the right framework." The interviewer pressed for clarity. Did Marina forgive Irina? "I don't forgive her. I don't condemn her. I just know what happened. Those are the facts. Everything else is interpretation, and interpretation changes nothing." The document that had started everything remained hidden in Marina's apartment, still concealed inside the hollowed-out engineering textbook. She had never destroyed it, never revealed possessing it. Physical evidence of betrayal kept secret, like the friendship itself, present but invisible, known but unacknowledged. Marina occasionally took it out over the years, reread the surveillance summaries, reminded herself that her memory was accurate, the betrayal real. Why keep it? She couldn't fully explain. Perhaps as proof for herself that she wasn't paranoid, that the rupture had justification, perhaps as reminder of what systems could do to human relationships. Perhaps simply because destroying it felt like erasing evidence of something that had happened, and Marina believed in documentation, in facts, in things that could be verified. In systems of total surveillance, trust becomes a form of revolution. To believe in someone completely, to confide without reservation, to maintain authentic intimacy. These acts defy the infrastructure of mutual suspicion. Marina and Irina had both failed this revolution, though in different ways. The tragedy wasn't their individual failures, but the system that made failure rational, that organized society around betrayal's logic. The Soviet Union was gone by 2003, dissolved into history, its mechanisms theoretically dismantled. But Marina understood that surveillance culture's effects persisted. The habits of suspicion, the difficulty of trust, the reflexive calculation before speaking, these had shaped an entire generation. You couldn't simply announce that openness was now safe and expect people to believe it. The wariness remained encoded in neural pathways by decades of necessary caution. Marina's last recorded words on the subject came at the end of her 2003 interview. Asked if she had any final thoughts about Irina Volkova and their friendship, she paused for a long moment before responding, "I don't forgive her. I don't condemn her. I just know what happened. And I know that we both lived in a system that made betrayal seem like survival. Maybe it was. Maybe we both survived the only ways available to us. Or maybe we both failed in different ways. I don't know. I'm too old now to be certain about things I once thought were simple. The impossibility of simple moral judgments, this was perhaps the deepest legacy of surveillance culture. Nothing was straightforward when every relationship existed within structures designed to exploit intimacy. Blame dispersed across individuals and institutions until it became unclear where responsibility resided. Everyone was guilty. No one was guilty. The system was guilty. But systems are abstractions, and abstractions can't be held accountable. By 2003, both women were elderly. Marina still lived in Moscow in the apartment where she had raised Katya, where she had found the document, where she and Irina had shared hundreds of Thursday evenings. Irina remained in Voronezh, according to occasional reports, living quietly in her mother's old apartment. They never reconciled, never spoke, never attempted to resolve what had fractured between them. Some wounds are too deep for healing. Some betrayals create distances that cannot be crossed. Some friendships, once broken, remain broken regardless of time or changed circumstances. Marina and Irina would carry their secrets to their graves. Marina's knowledge of the surveillance, Irina's knowledge of her role, both women's knowledge of what they had lost and how they had lost it. The final image is ordinary. Two elderly women living in separate cities, carrying memories of friendship that ended decades earlier. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematically resolved. Just the quiet persistence of damage, the weight of knowing, the impossibility of return. Soviet life had taught them both that some truths were too dangerous to speak and too important to forget. They had learned the lesson perfectly. And the silence they maintained across decades through political transformation into old age was testament to just how well the system had taught them what survival required. In the end, Marina neither forgave nor condemned. She simply knew. And knowledge, without the possibility of remedy or resolution, became its own form of punishment, carried silently, endured privately, acknowledged only in the spaces between words, where truth lived but could never be spoken.